One of the things that we do back in our country in Australia is we do an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to start this morning doing that as part of our traditions. We'd like to acknowledge the land of the Miami people and their traditional homelands. We also honour the way the many nations across this community who continue to care and are connected to the land that they work on for countless generations. Let us acknowledge that not only we honour the past, but inspire to make a difference to our future moving forward, and that we maintain our connection to land. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Joe. As I mentioned, my name is Chad Renando. I have a few different roles. Primarily with this one, we're talking about Ready Communities, where I'm the co-founder and CEO. Also attached to the University of Southern Queensland as a research fellow, and we map and measure the innovation ecosystem in Australia through my company's startup status and not-for-profit. And what I'd invite you to do, you all came here for a title of a certain program. You have certain expectations. I'd love for you to center in your mind what is it that you want out of the next 40 minutes. I'm gonna have a bit of a yarn, do some overarching positioning, and we'll have a bit of a conversation with Joe and Jesse, and then we'll be open for questions. But have in mind, what is it that you want out of this? And I have something that I would love for you to get out of this, which is maybe a new way to think about place making, and maybe a bit of a challenge and a provocation around what we think about ecosystem building, entrepreneurship, and innovation. Maybe some solutions for that. And I'll just hand over real quick to Joe and Jesse, just to introduce themselves, and maybe just to state what you would love these people to get out of this session.
Hello again, my name's Jo Kelly, or Joanne, which is what's up on the screen. I'm partnership lead for Learning the Maclay, which is a systems change community-led decision-making social impact program that's funded by the state and federal government. But my intention for you to get out of this is that, you know, we do things differently, and we need to do that in order to build up our community to step into the space of them challenging our systems but leading the way in decision making.
And hello, my name's Jesse. I have the great privilege of being a priest in the Anglican Church of Australia. I've been ordained now 10 years, working in communities, some very affluent communities and some very disadvantaged ones as well. I know that for all of you, you come from so many different backgrounds and so many different ecosystems of your own, and it's been a real privilege to be able to meet with you and to be able to hear your stories. But what I have noticed in all of these things is how much your place has defined the way that you are operating. And what I really hope that you get out of this session today is a challenge of this kind of idyllic notion of community. And when we are defining community, who is the community that we are consulting, that we're working with, who we are moving and interfacing with, and recognizing that in the work that Chad's about to go through, which we've been going through the last couple of years in our regional part of Australia, is that you can interface with all sorts of different organisations that come from different cultural backgrounds, different understandings of the world, and hopefully grow together in that work.
Excellent. Thanks, Jesse, and thanks, Joe. We're going to have a bit of a conversation around placemaking, a bit of a challenge to that, bit of a background on how we got here. So I've got a long history in what we would refer to as the innovation ecosystem. I ran an innovation hub in Ipswich, Australia. I am originally from Seattle. I've been in Australia for about 25 years. But I went to high school in Canada, so a bit of a broad background. Found myself in this thing called the innovation ecosystem. And when I was running that innovation hub, I thought, this is great. This is the answer to everything, especially a local government model. I thought it was fantastic. But I was really challenged because as much as we had our success, one of the top 7 most intelligent cities in the world as we were rated, and 150 entrepreneurs, raised $250,000 in an outer city area, and people sleeping on my park bench right outside my $1.25 million facility. And I looked at that and said, how do we not do that? And I really wrestled with it because I didn't have an answer. So I toured the different parts of the US, Boulder, Denver, San Francisco, started engaging with the Kauffman Foundation and Andy Stahl. and I started looking around saying, well, how do we do this differently? Because I saw we were enabling as much as we were inhibiting. And that's what I did my PhD on, is what is the contribution of all of this to a broad view of innovation, of a community resilience. So I got attached to a university, toured around Australia a bit, had some conversations, and eventually ended up bringing the Global Entrepreneurship Congress to Australia. And the lead into that, which I'll talk a little bit more about, really helped transform my thinking and really moving towards a place-based. It was good that Joe did an acknowledgement of country as we go here, because we do acknowledge that the work that we do has an inherent place-based approach, and that we build on the work and the custodians from centuries and generations past, and also that we're doing work that will be taken up by those in the future. And the same thing with a lot of our work in the innovation ecosystem. A lot of the work that I do is built on the amazing great work of so many others that I wouldn't be here without their contribution and work, and hopefully we can inspire others who will take it even further after. So I am going to start with a bit of a provocation, just talking about innovation. And the inevitability of innovation to create inequality and centralized wealth. It accelerates the processes that are already there and makes them go a bit faster. And what we've seen is a lot of that work makes it go faster towards wealth for those who already have access. And in a bit of a circular reference, inequality then inhibits further innovation. The ecosystem, the system by which that enables that, can help enable that outcome. And whatever we prepend with the concept of ecosystem is what that focus is, whether it's the innovation ecosystem, the entrepreneur ecosystem, startup ecosystem, business ecosystem, and that's the focus of it. Now we can hijack that by talking about inclusive ecosystems, indigenous ecosystems, female-led ecosystems, but it always seems to be a bit of a stretch. And what I found as I was working in communities is that to actually stretch into that area cost more and took a bit more effort. We had to create whole separate programs for it. And then some of the things that stretched even further, like say childcare centers, or addressing domestic violence, or addressing any of the issues, early childhood development, seemed to fall outside the remit, and that wasn't mine. And so there was other people that were doing that work, and when they were done with people that were in those programs, they'd hand them into the innovation ecosystem as some sort of handoff. Why can't we have an overall conversation? And so we started getting into things like collective impact and backbone organizations, and maybe there might be a different approach. And so what we're proposing is there might be a new frame of reference, not necessarily to say we don't do innovation ecosystem, but maybe to take a starting point of place of which entrepreneur innovation ecosystems sits within that. And so we can start with the base of having an overall conversation on what matters to the community. Because so many times I go into the community talking about innovation, entrepreneurship, and I look at people and they say, well, what are you to me? And I didn't necessarily have an answer, because my one solution for everything was entrepreneurship and innovation. Whereas if we met them with where they were at, and then also had innovation entrepreneurship as part of that. So the whole notion of placemaking came around of, say, 1950s, and obviously well before that, but this notion of placelessness, and how do we have a community-led approach to place? The notion of clusters and ecosystems through the 80s and 90s came through, but it has an inherent momentum, an inherent sense of progress, and towards an end goal of innovation diversification, which is important. But it's potentially mandating what that community needs. And so what we might be seeing is a return to place. And in Australia, we have this organization called Place, which is a collaboration of major foundations in Australia, plus the federal government, saying we have a vision for 50 places across Australia. Again, innovation entrepreneurship sits within that, but how do we transform at the place level? And so I'm going to give you a framework of one example of a place-based program of which Joe and Jesse were contributed to and participated in, called Ready Communities. And what this is a 2-year place-based approach where we go in, and my text is a little bit rough there, but we do an initial engagement. They do some mapping, some focus areas. We identify clusters. We do some activations within that. We develop the leaders. We have a catalytic event, and then we embed and support. This is a structured approach within, it provides a scaffolding around the place-based development. And the reason why we do this is because we acknowledge that within regional communities, there is an inequality that needs additional scaffolding and support work. There are systemic challenges that if I touch one area, there's so many other areas that are factors to it. And we focus on the enabling conditions that lead to long-term outcomes. And as we go through, there's a strong data component to it as well. A lot of people talk about mapping ecosystems, but what we do is we do map all of those interactions. We map all the policies that contribute to it, who receives the funding within it, all the conversations. And we map that not necessarily with an intent, but just to observe, but we also hand that map over to the community. So often we talk about mapping work, and it can be quite extractive, where I come in potentially as a paid consultant, I do the mapping, I take the information from you, who might be a volunteer, and I sell that information back to you as a report, as compared to doing the mapping, which actually gives the data back to that community. When I used to do the mapping work, I'd ask the question is, who's the custodian of this information? And quite often it would either be all of us, at which point there's none of us because there's no accountability, or it would be one institution that potentially wouldn't be a good custodian of that. And so we work with whatever that local backbone is to then hand that data back over to them so they can continue the work after we're gone. And so when I was talking before about the enabling conditions, this is our program logic, and most programs out there, if you're not familiar, they have a theory of change, they have a program logic, which is just a logical approach to how you do your program, which is your activities, your outputs, your outcomes, and your impact. And what we focus here is on the outcomes. Now, I told you before about the Global Entrepreneurship Congress leading into the GEC in Melbourne that we brought over there in 2023. For the 18 months before that, we had conversations with 500 leaders across Australia, across 30 different working groups. And we asked them all across different industry sectors, different focus on areas of impact, different functions of the ecosystem. And we were talking to them and said, well, what matters to you? Like, what's working really well? What's the best that can be? And how might you get there in an appreciative inquiry approach? When we took a step back from all those conversations, we saw that everything they said fit within one of these 5 areas. The first one is around clarity and understanding. And that's a lot of, we need some mapping. We need to have a shared knowledge. We need to have a shared language. The second one is around connection and connectivity. And that's our events. And are we connected internally? Are we connected from idea to scale? Is everybody around the table? Who's the missing people in our community? And do we have boundary spanning to those outside the community? Third one is around capability and capacity, and that's capability and capacity of our individual leaders, and do they have sustainable funding, and do they have the leadership development they need, and of our institutions. You know, what's the policy making of our local government like? Do we have an entity for risk capital? The fourth one is around collaboration for purpose. Are we getting together on the things that matter? Do we know what matters for our community? Are we making progress? Are we measuring how we're going? And do we know what success looks like? And the last one is around advocacy and promotion. Do we have a voice for that particular cause in the community? Those will lead to the long-term impacts, but the challenge that we have is so often if we look at the end impacts, if I look for jobs, if I look for investment, everything I see will then turn into that. And then when I stop looking, quite often those impacts stop. Where if I build the enabling conditions in the community, those will then produce the impacts. I just can't tell you what that looks like. And so what we're finding when we are applying this, at first loosely within KEMC and our trial that we'll talk about shortly, when we assessed through a Readiness Index the people that had been a part of the program, been a part of the conference, we saw increases across those different areas. And so just for a practicality perspective, what we've done now is we've turned that into a Readiness Index. We're measuring across 50 different indicators. But the way that we do that, one of the differences in the learnings that we had from the first year to the second year, when we applied it in the first year, we engaged with the community through that process I mentioned before. We identified some of their focus areas through the policy mapping and through the conversations. We developed some of the clusters. And then we looked for leaders to emerge out of those focus areas. The challenge with that is quite often those leaders didn't emerge, or they were already busy, or people are already part of 3 or 4 things, and they're like, we're not quite sure how to engage. We identified a bunch of initiatives, but so often in community, if you run through a process that develops initiatives, they say, great, yes, we know what we need to be done. Now can you do those for us, because we're really busy. And we ran into this cycle. Whereas what we're doing now in Grafton is we're identifying the leaders first. And this goes way back, whether you want to go all the way back to the 12 disciples or however you want to frame it. But working through the leaders, they then identify what their focus areas are, and they identify the initiatives that are reasonable for them. But we're also building capacity in those that will be left behind, as we are what we'd like to describe, designed to disappear. So all we do as a program is we provide scaffolding around that community, which then, and the outcome that we're after is their capacity to identify, develop focus areas, and do that again and see what the results are, not necessarily what we do as a result. And the other aspect that's really critical to what we do is the conference. So attached to the program, we have a 3-day conference called Social Impact in the Regions in September. It's happening this September in Grafton. You're all invited. And at that, it acts as a culmination point where 300 people from around Australia come to that community and act as that boundary spanning. It also provides a celebration and activation for what we've been doing over the last 10 months. And then they implement things, and we ask half of those people that come to the conference then to commit to returning to that community at least once. And if I have 150 people, if half of those come back, that's about 2 or 3 activations a month. And so it allows some of that continued renewal. So we apply the Readiness Index to those leaders through an expert survey before we start. We ask them what initiatives they might do. We put some of those in place. Then we assess the Readiness Index 1 year after, and invariably it goes up in quite a few of the different areas. And by that, we're starting to track it, but it's not just for our information, but for them to reflect back on how we've changed. And so within ChemC in the first year, it was our first one, but also we had some pretty decent outcomes. So one of them in particular is we went in there and we spoke to the community, and they had about 33% vacancy rate on their main street. And one of the areas we saw was this massive retail space. And we said, well, what are you doing with that? And they said, well, we don't know. I said, well, can we have it for our conference? Because we go in a region, we don't have a conference venue. We try and find one. And so they took down the scaffolding, we did it out, we made it as a conference, but then the local community center looked at that and said, well, can we use that as an innovation hub? And they said, sure, well, let's do it. We're doing a business case now. Now, if I went in there and I said, hey, we're going to do a business case we're going to do an innovation hub for your community, they would say, well, what's that? And that would have been the conversation, not the process by which that innovation hub came about. So that's just one very small example. We'll talk to a few more when we have a yarn now with Joe and Jesse on what that process was like and what does it mean to go into a community. Yes, I still have an innovation, entrepreneurship mindset and framing, but we start with a position of place and then say, what is it that's needed in the community and how might innovation entrepreneurship apply to it rather than starting with that one as a solution. And does that play? Do I just press again to play? That was just an example of a welcome to country, which Joe can share a little bit more, and also to give you an idea on where ChemC is on the map. And the other thing I'll just mention briefly is, other thing please just to keep in mind, on again a very practical example, often we talk about innovation entrepreneurship, but particularly in Australia, being as regional and remote as we are and impacted by the climate variability, we do experience things like fires and floods quite often. Always the question, when you have a natural disaster, when you have a major event, what is innovation entrepreneurship in the midst of that event? And Joe and Kelly are sitting here where we got inundated in ChemC. They got inundated in ChemC 1 month ago. And this is 1 week ago, and this is ChemC as of last week. And so through the conversation, we can say, well, how did the work we do last year, how is that manifesting itself now in the readiness of that community to respond to this, and then where does innovation entrepreneurship sit as they prepare to respond and react to the floods, of which Joe and Jesse are leaders within some of those efforts. So that's a bit of a brief overview on what we mean and potentially a transition to more of a place-based approach. We're going to have a bit of a yarn now with Joe and Jesse, and then happy to take your questions. Joe, I might start with you. And potentially, like you've heard me just have a bit of a yarn, and we've kind of prepped on what that was going to be about. But maybe first, a bit of a primer on a backbone organization. What is it that you lead? And what was your experience like over the last year on kind of going through the Ready communities, aligned with some of the other work, and where you're going now?
Thanks, Chad. As I said, I partnership lead with Learning the Maclay, which is a Stronger Places, Stronger People initiative funded by the federal and state government. I've been working in this position as partnership lead for just over 2.5 years. Being Backbone is a brand new conversation in our community. The Backbone team have been working mainly to get our brand out and the new language that we are embarking on. It's not a language that... I come from 30 years of service delivery, so when you're looking at that and the changeover in social impact is a very different language. And I'm very mindful of the conversation that I have with community because they don't understand this new language and the new terminology. And for example, we talk about a learning circle document, which is our action plan. We talk about our progress mapping, which is our benchmarking. If I go into my communities and talk about that language, they will not appreciate that at all. So it's about maintaining what is appropriate community language, and we use the terminologies, we switch code, and we use the language depending on the audience that we work with. So from a Ready Communities perspective, I've been part of it from the beginning. So I've been able to work along with Kerry initially, and then now with Chad coming on board. But the activation that we did last year in our community enabled our backbone team, or my backbone team, to step into places that we hadn't reached before. Whether it was the agricultural group, whether it was the creative arts industry, and in particular the Central Business District activation group, youth group, youth space, I meant to say, and housing. So all those 5 areas, we were able to access people that we hadn't engaged with before as part of that conversation. And we've maintained connection, particularly with the youth space, and the CBD activation group. And you could see on the video, like this time last week, both Jessie and I were on the ground supporting our community because even that water wasn't able to open up to the main street of our community. So, we're still juggling stuff right now, but it's about coming here and sharing our story, because now we're sharing our story, which means that you're part of our story as well. So, and that's the stuff that we've been able to do with Ready Communities.
Thanks, Joan. And one of the things you touched on is one of the reasons why we do have the 3 to 5 focus areas, which we test to see if clusters will develop, is because of the disparity. Innovation happens at the cross-section of different ideas, and because of the systemic nature of so many of the challenges. So one of the things we found is that probably about 40% of the people crossed over into different areas, but when we had ones that were for the general community, 60% just went to that one. So people are passionate about the area they want to change as much as some of those people that are passionate about the community themselves. But also, the other thing to pick from what you said is making sure that we have that connection to the local backbone to provide that facilitation where even if you may not have those introductions before. And one of the interesting things as far as a cross-section that you may not want to expect is faith-based organizations. Again, just through an innovation lens, quite often they may not come in, but some of the work, Jesse, like we found like a strong engagement with the church in some of the work that we were doing. So maybe what was your experience with it and some of the things you've seen since?
When we came together as part of the Ready Communities activations that were happening all across the town, what I noticed was just how willing people were to have conversations about the things that they were passionate about and how excited they were. One of the things that I've always known in the church is that people in those places are passionate about lots of different things. We're probably one of the few organisations that get together on a weekly basis, that are eating together, that are singing together, that are reading together, that are enjoying life together in that regular way. And just hands up, who is in walking distance to a church in your community? Most of you. All of these places are hubs of people who are passionate, who are trying to be good-willed, and who are trying to do different things. And I'm sorry that I got quite emotional seeing that video, because today's Tuesday. I was at 2 a.m. I was delivering sleeping bags to the 90 people in the evacuation centre just up the road from my house, because we were the only organisation that was able to get to the evacuation centre because everything had been cut out. And Joe and I have been on the phone every night for the last week, coordinating Black Hawk helicopters dropping food to isolated communities who haven't had access for the last week. And seeing those videos was really difficult. But what Ready Communities doing in the community came in order to bring angel investors into the community, to be able to bring all of these different networks that you all have in your place, and to bring those to the people who are leaders within their own communities, and then to be able to activate them in different ways. So what we were able to do as a part of Ready Communities' work was activate a group of people who have set up a community foundation. So we now have the Macleay Valley Community Foundation, and just last night I was on the phone and we've been offered $50,000 to be able to purchase new furniture for people who have lost everything in the flood. And all of that is now able to happen because relationships that I didn't have within the church, like I didn't know Joe before the Ready Communities program, and even though we'd been living in the same community, just think about how many people you don't know where you live and how incredible those people are. Look at the room around you, like how many people have you met? And these people are in your coffee shops, they are at your cinema, they are in all of these different places. I met Joe through this work in activating the CBD, and through that we are now able to have conversations about how can we advocate to big box shops like IKEA so that we are able to purchase this furniture at wholesale rates so that we can support our community, so that we can deliver to the community. We co-located a program the other day where my opportunity shop, like a charity store, secondhand goods, we took down all of these things and put it with the free barbecue that was down there for all of the emergency workers and those who were busy being covered in mud, scraping silt off of their floors the day after the flood receded. And as a result of these connections, we are now able to do place better. We're able to be community better, and we're able as well to identify the gaps in clarity. We're able to identify the gaps in collaboration. We're able to identify all of the different places where we are falling down, where we're not meeting the marks that we ought to be meeting, and able to come up with collaboration for purpose, which is to be able to change the system. So I've been so grateful for the Ready Communities program and the metrics around it. Now, I've been able to establish the Macleay Valley Community Foundation. Joe's now the custodian of an immense amount of data, and we can do all sorts of different things with that.
Thanks, Jesse, and I really appreciate your work, and it is absolutely impacting what's happened over the last week. And if there's anybody who's been involved in natural disasters or recovery or innovation, please reach us to us after, so we can take some of your knowledge back to the community as they're still rebuilding. One of the things I want to touch on is just some of those connections. The other big conversation in Australia is around decarbonization, around climate impacts, from wind farms coming into backyards, not in my backyard, a lot of those discussions. One of the frustrating things you find is that quite often people only get around the table when those big events happen, when there's a flood or where there's a big opportunity, and then that mobilizes them. So part of this process is building those relationships and that connectivity beforehand, and to get that collaboration so that when something happens, they're more ready, we should talk about. I'll do a quick caveat. Resilience is another word that we often hear. There are a lot of correlations to that. My end metrics for impact, we do watch those. I'm not saying I ignore those. There are 120 indicators of resilience across the 6 dimensions you saw up there. The reason why we don't use that word is it can be weaponized. Quite often we tell a community they're resilient, which actually can be a hidden code for I'm not going to give you the service you need so that you can stop needing to be resilient. So there's a bit of reaction to it. So we do use readiness because we think it fits more. I want to just do one more round of questions and we'll open up to the audience, Joe and Jesse, around some of those connections beforehand and bringing it back to a lot of the conversation in this conference around innovation entrepreneurship, on how the work that you do, whether it's in the church or the backbone, some of that work, how you might see that manifesting itself then towards a specific outcome for innovation, entrepreneurship, keeping in mind innovation is something new that adds value to a group of people. So what that means by it for the individual or for KEMC, and entrepreneurs are just people that take their own agency for something they own. Maybe just some thoughts on that.
Chad uses lots of big words, so I got part of the question. But what I'm really encouraged by, I think, in terms of what innovations I'm seeing within the community as a result of this work is that Chad mentioned before that that disused retail space is now got investment where they're looking to expand a tertiary education facility because, like a lot of regional areas, how many people are from regional towns smaller than 50,000? I don't know what it is in America. Everything's bigger here. And it was incredible to be able to see that that space is now changing. It's being utilised. Joe ran you've run 3 programs, I think, in there now since. And to see these disused spaces activated in ways that encourage the community to be able to come together is really powerful. The other particular one that I've noticed is just how all of these organisations, as a result of the work that Joe is doing as a part of a backbone community, a backbone organisation, is able to interface with so many different not-for-profits, with so many different commercial and retail spaces and businesses, and to be able to have them at the same table, to be able to say, what are we doing in this locality? What are we doing in this place to be able to change it?
Yeah, and just picking up with what Jesse said, like where we had social impact in the region last year, we've activated that with community events. So we've been able to engage with our community by having Halloween, where we had over 400 community members dress in Halloween, kids experience and things in the CBD that's never happened before. Last year each year we have what we call NAIDOC Week, which is National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Week of Observation. So we're coming up to that in July. Last year we did a community arts trail where we worked together with all the shops in the main street to display Aboriginal art, and that's the first time that's ever happened in the history of my community. So it's about how do we use the spaces here to promote what we're doing. The reality is our community is there's a lot of trauma. And, we're working on how do we unpeel that layer of trauma like an onion to get to the core of what it is. We've had a lot of dysfunctionality happening. We've had government support many things in our community that has harmed not only the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community, but all of our community. So how do we pull that in together? So we're dealing with the trauma, we're dealing with all of this stuff and truth-telling of what really happened in our community. And then it's about how do we leap forward to look at how do we develop our community into the space of taking on social enterprise, entrepreneurs stuff, building them up. We're working with young people right now who we just had a summit with on the 11th of April to talk about what do they see for the next 15, 20 years in our community. My biggest aspiration is that in 2036 is the bicentennial acknowledgement of the colonisation in my community. So we need to position all of our communities so that we're all seen as one, not as separate silos working individually. And that's the work that we endeavour to do over the next 11 years to get everybody on the same page.
Thanks, Joe. And I wish we had more time to just share with some of the realities of KEMSI. We don't want to
There is not enough time.
No, we don't want to go with a basis of a deficit, but there are some significant challenges. But again, just thinking forward to even the next 12 months, next month, I think, or a few weeks or next month, we've got Start Some Good, which is a social enterprise accelerator program coming and presenting the community that wouldn't have happened before. A lot we can talk about. I do want to open up for questions. I think we have about 10 minutes, 11 minutes left. Are there any questions in the audience? Just right there. I'm not sure if we have a roving mic. Do we? Excellent. Thank you. Just in the corner there.
On the readiness slide that you showed, you had a lot of inputs and outputs and outcomes and impact. Was there a dominant or input or outcome that had a disproportionate influence on the ecosystem building efforts, or were they sort of all equally weighted?
Connection is always a big one, right? But they are all in a logical flow for a reason, in that when we connect, I need to have a shared understanding and know who I'm connecting with and know who, if I'm missing anyone. When we do connect, I need the capability, capacity, and potentially governance structures in order to support that. I then need to then get into some sort of reason why we keep connecting. There needs to be a reason to come back around the table, and not just because I like my place. I need to be solving something. It's the best way to build community. And then we need a voice for it. So while one of them may come higher in terms of before and after surveys and areas that may have an impact, they're all contributing. One other point I'll note on that, when you think about the ecosystem assets in a community, with some other research that we did, is we find that when we ask questions on what did you use as a founder and what have you benefited from, maybe only 8% of a population may say a co-working space is essential to my success. But when we check on, say, for example, a government R&D grant, we find that 33% more of entrepreneurs rate an R&D grant essential to success if they're part of a co-working space. So while I'll tell you that connection and connectivity is what people visibly rate higher, they may not have rated that higher if it wasn't for some of the other factors that are contributing to it. But connection is one of the big ones. Other questions?
Hi there. Thanks, everyone. My name is Nathan Stevens. I'm a senior program officer at the Coleman Foundation in Chicago. We're trying to strengthen the local entrepreneurship ecosystem by supporting business support organizations, startup support organizations, access to capital, mentorship. Chicago, you can still see the effects of redlining in Chicago, and it's a practice that still happens today. So I'm wondering from anyone what your advice would be to private foundations, corporate foundations, and how they can best support placemaking efforts.
Joe?
I think from the lived experience that I've done, it's about going out and talking with them first, and talking in, the language that you just used. I would say my community would have no idea what you're talking about. So it's about making sure that the language you use is community accepted first. They wouldn't know how, they might not even know that that's even available. So, it's about how, go out, talk with them first, get a sense of what they're looking for, what's possibility, because some of our communities don't have any aspirations to do anything because they've never been given an opportunity. So this may be the first opportunity that they get to have a conversation with somebody first, to then build on that. So it's about building it up to the stage where they feel comfortable with the use of language and understand what's going on, to then step into that space confidently. One of the things that we have to do sometimes is we have to hold their hands. And I would be doing that first, to then see if that's going to be beneficial to that person or to that community or to that family, because again, they might not see beyond tomorrow. But if we're looking for them to look for 2 or 3 years in advance, some people just can't do that. They're in survival mode. So we need to hold their hand to get them out of survival mode, to grow them and grow them into that space, to then take that opportunity to step forward.
I think as well, in terms of, I landed in Chicago, I was there for all of 30 minutes, and it was incredible. And I know that in these major cities, you've got so many more communities. I'm into this kind of concept of every place is a community of communities, and that all of these different communities are interfacing in different ways. They all have different wants, needs, desires, callings, the ways that they need to operate. I think what Joe's getting to really is about how do we get to what the spirit of that place is, and without bringing in the religiosity of that word, but spirit comes from a Latin word, spiritus, which we all know in words like our respiratory system. It's what gives us life. And so I think unless the organizations, the philanthropic organizations, the foundations that you're working with, unless they understand the spirit of the people, what is it that gives them life, what is it that gives them breath, if you don't understand that, you won't be able to make that impact. So it's then coming together as those organizations to form a community that then goes into work with communities. And I think that the work of the backbone community, which is backbone a new word for some people, a couple of people. The idea of these backbone communities and organizations is in order to provide that stability, and if you can somehow find that neutral space where people can breathe together and have life together, you will find new life. And I just think that's getting to the core of what we do in placemaking.
Thanks, Jesse. Thanks, Joe. And just briefly, the role of foundations is really interesting. We often talk about the space between. We invest in programs, we invest in institutions and hubs, whatever. But it's that space between, the system, the ecosystem. And again, I asked the question, who's the custodian of this ecosystem? And if you're a participant in the system and you're the custodian of it, it can be very difficult because there's competitive tension. It can't be the state or government because, you know, the interface to the government can't be the government itself. And so what is that? Foundations play an absolutely critical role. It's just a really fine balance. One, making sure it's long-term. Got to stop the 3-year funding. 3-year funding, we spin things up, get the collaborative relationships. Second year, we start getting things going. Third year, we're all looking for a job because I got to find something to do and pay my mortgage. And so get nice, long 10-year funding. Joe's part of a 10-year Stronger People, Stronger Places program. Place at the national level is made up of our major foundations in collaboration with government, but foundation-led. I'm a big fan of foundations as the mechanism to do it. It's just you have to fit it within your mandate. It's not an easy answer, but happy to have a longer conversation. Any other questions? Eric. And just before Eric starts, I've been following Eric's work. Eric has informed a lot of what I do, so I'm a little bit nervous on what he's going to ask me right now because I always have Eric in the back of my mind thinking, what would Eric think? But go ahead, Eric.
Well, we're partners in crime. Thanks, Chad, Joanne, and Jesse. Really good work to bring entrepreneurial ecosystems, entrepreneurship towards human flourishing, because I think that's ultimately what matters. So highly appreciate it also to make it actionable. So my question is, how do you bring the long-term nearby? Because we know changing entrepreneurial ecosystems might take 5 to 20 years. If you are into the game of human flourishing, improving education, energy, that might also take 5 to 20 years. But as I think Joanne said, you cannot, if people are in survival mode, how do you bring that long-term vision? And also funders very often have this 3 to 5 year horizon. So how do you do this, bring the long-term nearby, but also don't fall in the trap that you're going to follow quick wins, so to say?
Yeah, really excellent question. Very briefly, and I'm keen to hear Joe and Jesse's thoughts. It's the enabling conditions. That's why I don't focus on impact, because jobs and those kind of things, quite often those are resulted from stuff that started 5, 10 years ago. And so if I can convince the funders to go on the journey with us, and this is actually transformed by a funder who said to me, Chad, we're actually changing our theory of change and our approach to program logic. Yes, you got to have those. And when you report on metrics, tell me what you did, tell me what you saw, and tell me what you think it means. Do that every year. And if every year those change, then that's progress, and we'll go on the journey with you. So part of it is partnering with people that have a bit of a longer-term vision. Again, 1 to 3 year cycles really hurt. It's a system-level change. And 2, focus on the enabling conditions that are going to get you those outcomes. If we can convince people that those are what we're after, and then we all watch the jobs and things like that emerge. Whereas if I lay the groundwork for a 7-year field in a crop, you know, and if I say, why don't I have everything growing in 3 years? I'm like, I don't know what to do with that. Joe, Jesse, anything to add on to that?
Can I jump on the phone? Sorry. I think that foundations and governments need to change their thinking about that 1 to 5 year horizon. I think that's really key for communities, because if these foundations are not able to sustain program for any longer than that, then there needs to be more work done by the foundations in actually how they're getting objectives met through the program that they're funding. If you have to solve these enormous systemic issues in 3 to 5 years, then I just don't think that there's opportunity to do that. So unless government and foundations change their mindset, I don't think we can do it.
And then further to that, the work that I do, again, with systems change is at least 7 years before we make impact in our community. One of the things that we're doing right now is we're working with our young people. we're actually developing them. As I said, we had a summit on the 11th of April. That has allowed us to look, not only listen, their voices were heard. So we're now reaching out to different places. They want to do leadership programs. They want to do development stuff. They want to look at some of the entrepreneurial stuff. But it's about making sure that it's the right timing for them. And obviously right now is not the right time because we're in recovery. And we've got to rebuild our basis first. But that's something that we'll be looking at later on in the year or early next year.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Jesse. Thank you for your questions. We are out of time. Thank you for all the work that you do. We often say the wisdom is in the room. We are all learning along with you. If you have any critique, comments, collaborations, really keen. We have a vision for about 20 communities over 10 years, and we're expanding it out from there. We have a conference in September. If anybody wants to come to Australia, I map the innovation ecosystem. I can make intros to whoever you want. I would love to have you there. Thank you very much. Happy to chat after.
A conference that you will have never been to before. It is incredible.
Thank you.
And unique.